We're going to talk about secure collaboration and how we can leverage ABAC for unstructured data. But before we get into the specifics of, I'd say, how we do this and what it looks like in real life, let's talk about why this is so important. And where this stems from is really looking back at the last couple of decades of how we as an industry have tried to address governance in organizations. And the reality is, from a technology standpoint, the technology, I'd say the integrations, the technology, the foundational elements of a solution to really kind of solve this problem just weren't available. And that often led people down the path of what we call governance barriers. And we put these governance barriers up in the organization, they'd often create frustration for users. So as much as we need to both simultaneously collaborate and get information, to and from people within the organization as well as outside the organization, governance and compliance, of course, is central to all this, to protecting our data, and often it would create frustration. What happens when we put a barrier in front of our knowledge workers? Well, we end up in a place where they find ways around those barriers, and they turn to things like shadow sharing, and often those approaches are less secure. They're certainly more expensive down the road when it comes to the need to try to manage all these different processes, and it often is just, from a collaboration standpoint, just less efficient. So the way that we like to think about this, and really I'd say is the spirit of the partnership that we've got with Axiomatics, is we don't want to put barriers in front of our users and in front of our knowledge workers as they're sharing documents, files, and emails. We want to deliver what we call trusted collaboration bridges. We want to give them guardrails as they are trying to share in these sensitive scenarios, and do it in a way that's safe. So we don't want to prevent them from doing their job. We want to enable them, but enable them to do it safely with the right guardrails and checks in place. What's ironic about delivering on trusted collaboration is it's actually delivered through a zero trust strategy and through the principles of zero trust. In order to put these barriers, put these guardrails in place, what we need to do is we need to ensure only the minimum amount of access is provided to enable collaboration. In some instances, it's okay for everybody in the organization, and maybe even outside the organization, to have access to certain information. But there's other scenarios when there's only a particular group of named users that you may want to have access to this data, and that's, again, a bit less permissive and a little bit better. But oftentimes, as we look at organizations that, I would say any Global 2000 organization today, or anybody sort of in federal or government or military, there are often scenarios where you have to ensure that the right context and the right attributes of a user are in place for them to be able to access that data. Just because they had access to the information today does not necessarily mean they should be allowed to have access to that information tomorrow. And to deliver on this, and to deliver on these principles of zero trust for data, it really comes down to enabling what really the industry has talked about for many years, is a data-centric security strategy. We need to be able to identify what data we need to protect, right, based on perhaps the sensitivity, have context about that data, about the users, about that moment in time to make a decision from a policy standpoint. And then we got to make sure that the people who are accessing that data are in fact the right people. And data-centric security isn't just about a foundation for unstructured data, but it's also a foundation for structured data. And so whether you're, as an organization, looking at solving this for structured or unstructured data, it applies in both scenarios. Now, today, we're going to focus on unstructured data and really how eShare and Axiomatics have kind of brought data-centric security to life in that context. And from a technology ecosystem standpoint, there's a number of sort of pieces that come together here, as you'll see in the demo. So the first is, organizations have been embracing labeling, as we know, for many years, but I'd say there's been a pretty massive acceleration over the last 3 or 4 years, and Microsoft Purview's certainly at the center of that. And labels can go a long way to helping to identify the context of the data. Are they mandatory to bring this to life? Not necessarily. There's other ways you could get to it, but certainly labels do help. And it's not just, you don't necessarily have to just use labels at a file level or at an email level. You can leverage labels at a folder or at a repository or at a container level. Then, of course, there's a need to enforce policy, and that's where eShare comes in, be it at the time of sharing or at the time of access. And then there's this need to bring signals to the equation, right? Bring that context to the equation, and that's where Axiomatics plays a vital role. And then from a tracking and reporting perspective, eShare, as we'll talk about, can provide sort of a level of tracking and analytics that gives you insights into who, what, when, where, and why data has been accessed. And of course, all this data and all these activities and on events that are taking place can all be forwarded to your SIM, to a Splunk, to whatever it might be, to help ensure that you've got um, the right audit logs for compliance and attestation.
So Mark, if I may, right there, I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
one area that a lot of our customers often overlook is those logs. Um, there are virtually a treasure trove of information, right? You can see activity that you may not have seen before, and you can also use that to identify if you're under attack, right? If you see a spike in deny requests, you can take a look at that. Or you can even see the effectiveness of a marketing campaign, for example, right? Are you
Yeah.
driving more people there? And you can learn people's behaviors better.
Yeah, great point, Mark. And I think it's those real time alerts and the ability to sort of drive some automation on top of that data that is sort of a level. If we think of kind of a crawl, walk, run, I'd say kind of falls into that walk category. But you need the foundation of the data in place for you to get to that point where you can drive those alerts and those real time activities. But yeah, great insights and great points. Now I think as we look at those different technologies. The key to this strategy and the key to this partnership really comes in the form of context. And that's where Axiomatics plays a very strong role. When we think of what we need to do to enforce policy, obviously the Microsoft ecosystem's got a lot of different context within Microsoft 365, and Purview provides information at a label level, can provide information about file activity, sensitive information types. That's all great and wonderful. But in big enterprises, the reality is the context exists often outside of your Microsoft 365 ecosystem. It might be based on identity signals. It could be based on the user, the role, their organization. Could be based on specific enterprise signals, right? Certain applications, perhaps they're it could be homegrown applications, could be homegrown databases, could be COTS applications, whatever it might be. These signals are all critical to sort of coming into place to making that real-time decision about who can access what information, where and when, and of course, and so eShare kind of helps bring all of that to life from a policy standpoint. One of the what's interesting is when we think of zero trust, when we think of data-centric security, I mean, in many respects, this was a conversation we were having in 2012, right? Is how do you the constructs of zero trust it certainly started at sort of the network level, right? And then started to work its way in as we started to think about applications and identity, and data was always there, but there was just, I'd say, some low-hanging fruit that had to get done before we really got to the data level. And there was a lot of pieces. There was, from a technology standpoint, there just wasn't pieces of the puzzle in place to make that happen. But over the last 4 or 5 years, with Microsoft 365 becoming the standard at enterprises, there is now an opportunity to combine link-based sharing with context and make zero trust for data a reality. If we think of Microsoft 365 as the container for that data, whether it be in a commercial site or a GCC high cloud or sovereign cloud or whatever it might be, that in of itself, if you can keep that data in your control and at the same time enable link-based sharing, you now have a place where you can maintain full control of that data at all times. The challenge is with, I'd say, a traditional model where effectively you give data away, whether that be through guest access or third-party file share, or even just email attachments, is at the moment that you share a file, that data leaves your organization. You have no way of knowing who's accessing that data, where they're at, and whether or not, and there's no way of you revoking that data at the same time. And so from a partnership perspective, labels, signals, policy enforcement all come to life as we look to enable link-based sharing from Microsoft 365. And when we do this, we can then provide a level of attestation and analytics that allow you to understand who, what, when, where, and how data is accessed. So that's kind of at a solution or a reference architecture level. What I'm going to do now is actually step into showing you this live and showing a couple of demos. Before I do that, I'll just step through kind of what the workflow is here for both external and internal collaboration, what some of the key pieces of the puzzle are to bring this to life. So the first thing is, when it comes to removing barriers and applying guardrails, we don't ever want to have to take our users out of the flow of work. We don't want to ever have to force them to context switch, right? And so When we think of some of those traditional barriers we've put in front of users, be it third-party file systems is a great example. Download the file, go put it into a third-party file system, share based on the policies in that system, which are separate from the policies in your Microsoft 365 system. That forces users to duplicate data, to leave their flow of work, and that's just frustrating. What we want to do is want to enable people to share natively from Microsoft 365. As they go to share, we also want to ensure the organization can maintain a closed tenant. One of the big challenges that have sort of evolved over the last 5 years as organizations have adopted Microsoft 365 is they start using guest access, and there might be a need for guest access under certain circumstances, but we've seen scenarios where people have got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of external identities that they aren't managing, right? They're just provisioning. They're effectively poking holes into the SharePoint tenant, providing access to information. As we enter this world where protecting our data is of course more important than ever before, allowing an organization to maintain a closed tenant is central to that entire strategy, which of course is something we do here. The third thing, which might sound obvious saying based on how I'd set this up, but we want to ensure that data never has to leave your Microsoft 365 tenant. We want to share links at all times. That's the goal. We want to make sure that data stays in your control, so that if you want to revoke that link, you can do that. Now, there are instances where, as you're going to share outside the organization, perhaps somebody has to download the file, or you think they have to download the file. A bit of an interesting stat from our side. When external users are given the option to download files, in more than 90% of the instances, they don't. So what that means is, even though download is available, if you provide a great user experience, if you enable the collaboration to take place within with the tools, and I'd say as much of an equitable experience as you can, people don't need to download the files, and therefore it stays in your control. And that leads to the fourth key item in all this, is that we want to provide security with all the controls they ever would need to provide to deploy a least privilege strategy, right? In some instances, maybe you want to provide people the option to download, but in other instances you don't, right? And you want to give people the option to dial in those permissions and dial in those controls. And of course, from a security standpoint, this is critical.
What drives me absolutely up the wall is, when you're collaborating with somebody on a file, when you're working on your own files, it's fine. But as soon as you start collaborating, the number of replicated files, you end up with this version 1.1, version 1.2. The people that are trying to find some kind of clever way to version the document, but at the end of the day, you start searching your network drives, and you've got 10 different copies of the same exact file. You start wondering which one's the right one, which ones do we start to purge. It's a mess. So if everybody is collaborating on that same document, it makes everything so much easier. So I loved that point, and I wanted to hammer it home.